February 1943. The Atlantic Ocean was cold, gray, and restless, the kind of morning where the horizon disappears into fog and steel decks, sweat with sea spray. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, something happened that made even experienced sailors freeze in place. A sound exploded across the water so violently that men several miles away felt it through the soles of their boots. 9 massive guns fired together. Each one launched a shell heavier than a small car, a solid piece of hardened steel, weighing more than 2,700 pounds. The shells tore through the air faster than the speed of sound, and the blast pushed a shockwave across the ocean like a giant invisible hammer. The ship that fired them actually slid sideways in the water from the force, 45,000 tons of armored steel shifting like it had been shoved by a giant hand. Sailors grabbed railings and ladders to keep their balance. Some laughed nervously. Others simply stared in silence, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. They all knew one thing immediately. This was not an ordinary warship. Standing on that deck was a young sailor named James Kowalski. He was only 24 years old, a former factory welder from Cleveland, Ohio. Before the war, he had spent his days repairing broken machinery and welding steel plates inside a noisy industrial building that smelled of oil and smoke. He had never expected to stand on the deck of one of the most powerful ships ever built. When the factory closed during the economic slowdown before the war, he joined the Navy mostly because his family needed money. His mother struggled to buy groceries. The Navy paycheck helped keep the lights on at home. Kowalski was not a strategist or a hero in the traditional sense. He was simply one of thousands of ordinary Americans pulled into a global conflict that few people fully understood. Yet, on that cold morning in 1943, he was standing in the middle of a moment that would quietly change naval warfare forever. The ship beneath his feet was the USS Iowa. At first glance, she looked like a traditional battleship, the kind of giant war machine that had dominated oceans for decades. Her massive armor belt could stop shells that would destroy smaller ships instantly. Her 9 16-inch guns were the largest weapons carried by any American battleship at the time. But the most important thing about Iowa was not her guns or her armor. It was her speed. Iowa could travel at 33 knots, faster than almost any other battleship ever built. That speed would soon change how entire fleets operated. To understand why Iowa mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning of the war in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the United States and destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet. Battleships burned in the harbor. Sailors died trapped inside sinking hulls. The attack shattered the idea that the United States was safe behind 2 massive oceans. Suddenly, the war was real, immediate, and terrifying. Japan moved quickly after Pearl Harbor, capturing islands and territories across the Pacific. The Philippines fell. Guam and Wake Island were lost. Singapore collapsed. Japanese forces pushed closer and closer to Australia. For months, the situation looked dangerous for the Allies. During this period, naval warfare itself was changing. For decades, battleships had ruled the oceans. These enormous armored ships fought each other using giant guns in dramatic long-range duels. But the war revealed something new. Aircraft carriers were becoming the real kings of naval warfare. A carrier could launch dozens of aircraft that could attack ships hundreds of miles away. Planes could sink battleships before those ships ever came close enough to fire their guns. The battleship era was not exactly over, but it was clearly changing. However, aircraft carriers had a serious weakness. When a carrier launched or recovered aircraft, it needed to travel at high speed into the wind. The deck was crowded with fuel lines, bombs, and fragile aircraft preparing for takeoff. During those moments, the carrier could not easily maneuver or defend itself against sudden attack. It was powerful, but also extremely vulnerable. What carriers needed was protection from fast, heavily armed ships that could defend them against enemy vessels trying to break through. That created a serious problem for the United States Navy. Most existing battleships were simply too slow. They could travel at about 27 or 28 knots. That might sound fast, but a carrier-operating aircraft needed to move even faster. Destroyers could keep up, but they were lightly armored and carried smaller guns. Cruisers were stronger, but still lacked the raw firepower needed to discourage enemy battleships or heavy cruisers. The Navy needed a new kind of ship, a ship that combined the armor and guns of a battleship with the speed of a cruiser. Many experts believed such a ship was impossible. For years, naval architects debated the problem in conference rooms, filled with blueprints and technical reports. Committees met again and again, discussing propulsion systems, hull designs, and engineering limits. Every proposal faced the same problem. To move a ship weighing 45,000 tons at 33 knots required an enormous amount of power. Increasing speed meant stronger engines, which required more space, which increased weight, which required even more power. It was a difficult engineering puzzle that seemed to create more problems every time someone tried to solve it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected play. Ace. Arthur Franklin was not a famous naval architect. He was a mechanical engineer who worked on steam turbine systems for industrial power plants. His job normally involved designing equipment that produced electricity, not warships. But Franklin had a reputation among his colleagues for one unusual habit. He constantly solved problems using numbers. Whenever he heard someone describe a technical challenge, he automatically started calculating possible solutions in his head. One evening during the mid-1930s, Franklin was sitting in a small diner near a naval engineering office after a meeting about boiler efficiency. Several Navy engineers were discussing the carrier escort problem. They complained that a battleship fast enough to protect carriers simply could not exist. The weight, the engines, the drag from the hull moving through water, everything made it unrealistic. Franklin listened quietly for several minutes. Then he pulled a paper napkin from the table, took out a pen, and started writing numbers. He calculated the relationship between hull length and water resistance. He estimated the power needed from turbine engines. He compared those numbers to what existing industrial turbines could produce. Slowly, a design began to appear on the napkin. Instead of building a wider battleship like earlier designs, Franklin proposed something longer and more streamlined. A long, narrow hull could actually move through water more efficiently at high speed. The concept was unusual. Most naval designers believed longer hulls created more drag. Franklin's calculations suggested something different. When he showed the idea to naval engineers later, many of them laughed. One officer reportedly told him that he had designed a battleship that behaved like a racing boat. Another joked that Franklin was proposing a locomotive that could also fly. To experienced naval planners, that numbers seemed unrealistic. Battleships were supposed to be powerful and stable, not fast like cruisers. The idea simply did not fit the established thinking of the time. Franklin did not give up. Instead, he returned to his hotel room and rechecked every calculation. For 3 nights, he worked almost without sleep, testing different engine arrangements and hull shapes. By the time he finished, he had created a complete propulsion concept that could theoretically push a battleship past 33 knots. The engines would produce more than 200,000 horsepower, an enormous amount for a warship of that era. It would not be easy to build, but Franklin believed it could work. Eventually, his calculations reached an officer willing to listen carefully. Rear Admiral William McGuire reviewed the numbers and realized something important. The design might actually be possible. It would require advanced engineering and significant resources, but it solved the exact problem the Navy faced. A battleship fast enough to protect aircraft carriers could finally exist. The project moved slowly at first. Naval construction programs always required funding approval, technical studies, and political support. But as tensions in Europe and Asia increased during the late 1930s, the United States began preparing for the possibility of war. Suddenly, the idea of a fast battleship no longer seemed strange. It seemed necessary. By 1939, the design had become official. The new ship would be enormous, heavily armored, and powered by powerful turbines capable of pushing it faster than any American battleship before it. When construction began, workers in shipyards across the country started assembling one of the most advanced warships ever attempted. Most of those workers never realized how unusual the ship truly was. To them, it was simply another massive project in a busy shipyard. Lighters connected steel plates. Engineers installed engines and pipes. Electricians wired complicated control systems. Thousands of small tasks slowly turned piles of metal into a warship. Among those workers was James Kowalski, the young welder from Cleveland who would later stand on the deck during the gun tests. At the time, he was simply another pair of hands helping build a ship during a time when America was rushing to prepare for war. He worked long hours inside narrow steel compartments, welding sections of hull that few people would ever see once the ship entered service. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the pace of construction changed immediately. Shipyards worked day and night. Workers pushed themselves harder because everyone understood that the war in the Pacific was growing more dangerous. The new battleship had to be finished as quickly as possible. Finally, in 1942, the massive hull slid into the water for the first time. The USS Iowa officially joined the United States Navy soon afterward. Her sea trials proved something remarkable. The ship reached speeds that most experts once believed impossible for a battleship. The long hull design cut through the water exactly as Franklin's calculations predicted. The enormous turbines delivered the power needed to maintain those speeds, even when the ship was fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and crew. The impossible ship had become real. Yet the most dangerous challenges for the Iowa were still ahead. Powerful ships alone do not win wars. They must be used correctly. And the Navy still needed to decide exactly how this revolutionary battleship would operate. Some admirals believed she should fight in traditional battle lines against enemy surface fleets. Others believed her speed made her perfect for protecting aircraft carriers across the vast Pacific Ocean. That argument would soon become one of the most important debates in naval strategy, and the outcome would determine whether the Iowa became just another battleship or something far more important. Because somewhere in the Pacific, Japanese naval planners were already watching the American fleet carefully. They were studying every new ship, every tactical change, every small shift in strategy. And when they finally understood what the Iowa could do, they would begin planning a way to destroy her. The story of that confrontation is where the real danger begins. When the USS Iowa officially entered service in early 1943, the United States Navy had created something extraordinary. On paper, the ship solved one of the biggest tactical problems of the Pacific War. She was fast enough to keep up with aircraft carriers and powerful enough to destroy almost any enemy surface ship that tried to threaten them. But creating a revolutionary warship is only half the battle. The real challenge is convincing the military system to actually use that ship in the way it was designed. And in the spring of 1943, there was one man whose opinion carried enough weight to delay that change. Rear Admiral Harold Sinclair Donahue had served in the Navy for more than 3 decades. He had commanded ships before many of the younger officers now serving under him had even graduated from school. In his mind, the role of a battleship was simple and unquestionable. Battleships existed to fight other battleships. For generations, that belief had shaped naval doctrine. Massive armored ships lined up in battle formations and exchanged heavy gunfire until one side was destroyed or forced to retreat. It was a concept that had defined naval warfare for decades, and Donahue believed it would continue to define it. When the Iowa entered service, Donahue viewed her not as a new type of escort vessel, but as the most powerful gun platform the Navy had built. In his opinion, placing such a ship alongside aircraft carriers would waste its true potential. Instead, he believed Iowa should operate in a traditional battle line where her massive guns could be used against enemy capital ships. To him, using a 45,000-ton battleship simply to guard aircraft carriers seemed unnecessary. Unfortunately for the sailors fighting in the Pacific, the war itself was proving otherwise. Aircraft carriers had become the center of naval warfare. They could strike enemy fleets hundreds of miles away using aircraft, but carriers were extremely vulnerable during flight operations. When planes were launching or landing, the carrier had to maintain a steady course and speed into the wind. The flight deck would be crowded with aircraft, preparing for takeoff or returning from missions. During those moments, the ship could not maneuver quickly or defend itself effectively if a fast enemy force suddenly appeared. Destroyers and cruisers attempted to protect carriers, but they struggled to keep up during long operations at high speed. Their guns were powerful, but they lacked the overwhelming firepower that a battleship could bring to a fight. Enemy commanders understood this weakness and occasionally attempted to exploit it. Several escort ships had already been lost while trying to protect carriers during these vulnerable periods. Yet the new battleship, built specifically to solve this problem, the USS Iowa, was still operating in the Atlantic escorting supply convoys. She was protecting cargo ships rather than defending the carriers that needed her most. To many officers serving aboard her, the situation felt frustrating. They understood the ship's capabilities and believed she could make a difference in the Pacific. But decisions about fleet assignments were made far above their rank. Captain John McCrae, Iowa's commanding of Pfizer, was one of the few men willing to challenge the situation. McCrae was known as a calm and thoughtful officer, not someone who raised his voice or made dramatic speeches, but he also understood exactly what kind of ship he commanded. The Iowa was not merely another battleship. She was something new, something faster and more flexible than any battleship before her. McCrae submitted a formal request asking that the Iowa be reassigned to escort aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The request moved through the Navy's chain of command and eventually reached the desk of Admiral Donahue. The answer came back quickly: denied. The admiral believed Iowa belonged in the Atlantic battle line, not protecting carriers thousands of miles away. McCrae submitted the request again several weeks later, after additional reports from the Pacific described carrier groups facing increasing pressure from Japanese forces. The answer came back the same: denied. The third request produced no different result. To Donahue, the matter was already settled. Battleships fought battleships. That was how naval warfare worked. The idea of a giant armored ship acting as a protective escort still felt wrong to him. But the war was changing faster than the Navy's traditional thinking. Aircraft carriers were now launching hundreds of missions across the Pacific. Japanese naval forces were searching for weaknesses in the American formations. Every carrier lost would mean hundreds of aircraft destroyed and thousands of sailors killed. McCrae believed the Iowa could prevent that kind of disaster. Finally, in April 1943, the captain requested a personal meeting with the admiral. The conversation took place inside an office at Naval Station, Norfolk. When McCrae entered the room, Donahue was already seated behind a desk covered with reports and operational maps. The admiral listened as McCrae explained again why Iowa should escort carriers. He described how the ship's speed allowed her to match carrier movements during flight operations. He described the enormous range of her main guns and how enemy ships would hesitate to approach a carrier group guarded by such firepower. Donahue waited until the captain finished. Then he calmly replied that the Navy did not build battleships simply to watch over airplanes. Iowa was designed to fight enemy surface fleets. That was where she belonged. The meeting ended with the admiral's decision unchanged. For most officers, that would have been the end of the matter. Challenging a superior officer repeatedly could damage a career, but McCrae believed too strongly in the ship's potential to let the idea disappear. Instead of filing another formal request, he began searching for another way to prove his argument. Opportunity arrived in the form of a fleet training exercise scheduled for May 1943 near the waters around Bermuda. Several ships would participate, including the aircraft carrier USS Essex and a group of destroyers acting as escorts. Officially, the Iowa would only observe the exercise. But McCrae had a different idea. The exercise would simulate carrier flight operations under realistic conditions. The Essex would operate aircraft while her escorts attempted to maintain defensive positions around her. McCrae believed that if the Iowa simply joined the formation during those operations, the difference would become obvious to everyone watching. Early on the morning of the exercise, a group of senior naval officers gathered aboard a cruiser positioned nearby to observe the training. They expected to watch a routine demonstration of fleet coordination. Instead, they witnessed something unexpected. The carrier Essex began launching aircraft while traveling at high speed into the wind. Her deck crews moved quickly across the Flight deck, guiding planes toward takeoff positions. 4 destroyers attempted to maintain their defensive positions around the carrier. They were fast ships, but even they struggled slightly to match the exact speed and course changes of the carrier during continuous flight operations. Then, several miles away, a large shape appeared on the horizon. At first it looked like a distant gray line cutting across the water. As it approached, observers realized it was the USS Iowa moving at full speed. Unlike most battleships, she did not appear slow or heavy in the water. Her long hull sliced through the waves, throwing a massive bow wave outward as she accelerated. Within minutes, the battleship reached the carrier group. Without hesitation, she moved into position alongside the Essex, perfectly matching the carrier's speed. The giant warship turned whenever the carrier turned, maintaining position with surprising precision. Observers on the cruiser watched silently as the demonstration continued. The Iowa held formation effortlessly, while the destroyers struggled to maintain their positions at the edge of the defensive screen. The difference was obvious, even without reading the speed indicators. Here was a ship large enough to fight any enemy cruiser or battleship, yet fast enough to remain beside a carrier during flight operations. Her radar systems and fire control equipment could detect threats at great distances. Her guns could destroy those threats long before they reached torpedo range. For several minutes, no one spoke. The officers simply watched the battleship maintain position beside the carrier like a giant armored guardian. Finally, one of the senior admirals observing the exercise quietly asked for a radio connection to Admiral Donahue. The results of the exercise were difficult to ignore. Reports showed that the Iowa maintained full combat readiness while traveling at speeds equal to the carrier's maximum operating speed. Her presence expanded the defensive area around the carrier dramatically because her guns could engage threats from far greater distances than destroyers alone. In simple terms, the Iowa made attacking a carrier group far more dangerous for any enemy force. Within weeks, the Navy changed her assignment. The USS Iowa would join carrier groups operating in the Pacific. For the sailors aboard her, the news spread quickly through the ship. James Kowalski heard about it while standing watch on deck one evening. Some sailors cheered quietly, others simply nodded. They had always believed the ship belonged in the Pacific, where the fighting was most intense. But their excitement was mixed with something else: anticipation. Everyone understood that once Iowa reached the Pacific, she would no longer be performing training exercises. Real enemies would be searching for American carriers. Real battles could happen at any moment. By the summer of 1943, the Iowa was crossing the Pacific Ocean toward the growing conflict. American carrier groups were already launching strikes against Japanese positions across the region. The war was slowly turning in the Allies' favor, but Japanese naval forces were still dangerous and capable of sudden attacks. When Iowa finally joined a carrier task force, many carrier officers were unsure how to feel about the giant battleship. They were used to operating with destroyers and cruisers, not massive armored ships carrying 9 enormous guns. Some worried that the battleship might interfere with flight operations or limit the carrier's ability to maneuver. But those doubts began to fade once the ships started operating together. The Iowa proved capable of matching the carrier's movements almost perfectly. Her radar systems provided additional detection coverage, and her guns offered protection not surface threats that destroyers alone could not match. Slowly, the carrier crews began to understand something important. The Iowa was not there to replace their escorts. She was there to make sure no enemy commander would ever risk attacking them directly. But far away in Japan, naval intelligence officers were already studying American fleet movements carefully. They were analyzing reports from reconnaissance aircraft and submarines. Again and again, they noticed the same unusual detail. A very fast American battleship seemed to appear whenever carrier groups were operating nearby. Japanese planners realized that this single ship was disrupting tactics that had worked earlier in the war. Attacking carriers during flight operations had once been a promising strategy. Now, it was becoming far more dangerous. Soon, they began discussing a new plan. If the Iowa could not be avoided, then perhaps she could be isolated. And if she could be isolated from the carrier she protected, then the most powerful battleship in the American fleet might finally become vulnerable. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, Japanese commanders began designing a trap, and before long, the Iowa would sail directly toward it. The morning of October 25, 1944 arrived quietly over the waters near Samar in the Philippines. The ocean looked calm. Soft waves rolled across the gray surface. Low clouds hung in the sky, but underneath that calm surface, one of the most dangerous naval encounters of the entire Pacific War was about to unfold. At that moment, a small American naval group known as Task Unit 7743, often called Taffy 3, was operating in the area. This force was not designed to fight major battles. In fact, it was one of the weakest types of naval groups the United States had. Taffy 3 consisted mostly of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers used to support ground troops. These ships were said low, lightly armored, and not built for heavy naval combat. Their main mission was simple: provide air support for American soldiers fighting on the islands, protect transport ships, and assist amphibious operations. But the men on those ships had no idea that they were about to face one of the most powerful fleets ever assembled by Japan. The Japanese center force during the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy launched a complex plan. One part of this plan involved sending a powerful fleet, called the Center Force, through the San Bernardino Strait. This fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, Kurita's force included some of the most powerful warships Japan had left. Among them were several heavy cruisers, destroyers, and, most terrifying of all, the giant battleship Yamato. Yamato was the largest battleship ever built. It carried enormous guns that could fire shells weighing over 3,000 pounds. These shells could travel over 25 miles. If ships like Yamato found lightly defended American escort carriers, the result could be devastating. And on that morning, that is exactly what happened. The first sightings, just after sunrise, American radar operators began noticing something unusual. Large contacts were appearing on radar. At first, many sailors assumed these might be friendly ships, but the contacts kept growing. More ships appeared. Then, even more. Soon it became clear that this was not a small group. This was a full battle fleet. When lookouts finally saw the ships on the horizon, the realization hit hard. Massive warships were approaching fast. Battleships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and they were heading directly toward Taffy 3. For the American sailors on those small escort carriers, the situation looked almost hopeless. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and completely exposed. Immediate action. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the commander of Taffy 3, quickly understood the danger. His escort carriers could not survive a direct attack from battleships. Their armor was too thin, their speed was too low, and their guns were far too small. So Sprague made a desperate decision. He ordered the escort carriers to turn away and run while launching every available aircraft. Planes took off quickly from the small flight decks. Many of these aircraft were not armed for naval combat. Some carried only machine guns. Others carried depth charges designed for submarines. But the pilots knew one thing. If they did nothing, their fleet would be destroyed. So they flew toward the incoming Japanese ships anyway. Smoke screens and destroyers while the carriers tried to escape. The small destroyers of Taffy 3 moved forward. These destroyers were much smaller than battleships. But they had one advantage: speed. They also carried torpedoes, powerful underwater weapons capable of sinking large ships. One destroyer in particular would soon become famous for its actions: the USS Johnston. Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans. Evans was known for being bold and aggressive, and when he saw the approaching Japanese fleet, he did not hesitate. He turned his ship directly toward the enemy. It was an incredibly risky move. A destroyer charging toward battleships was like a small boat charging toward tanks. But Evans understood something important. If the Japanese fleet reached the escort carriers, hundreds or even thousands of American sailors could die. So he chose to fight. The charge of USS Johnston. The Johnston accelerated forward at high speed. Its engines pushed the ship through the waves as it moved toward the enemy formation. Soon, Japanese ships began firing. Huge shells splashed into the water around the destroyer. These shells were designed to destroy armored battleships. Against a small destroyer, they were even more dangerous. But Johnston kept moving. Commander Evans ordered his guns to fire. The destroyer's smaller cannons began launching shells toward the Japanese cruisers. Then the moment came. Evans gave the command: fire torpedoes. Several torpedoes launched into the water, racing toward the enemy ships. Moments later, one of them struck a Japanese cruiser. The explosion was massive. The cruiser was badly damaged and forced to withdraw. For a moment, the tiny destroyer had actually hurt a much larger ship. But the battle was far from over. Air attacks from the escort carriers. Meanwhile, American aircraft from the escort carriers began attacking the Japanese fleet. These were not large carrier aircraft. Most were FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. Many pilots had little experience fighting battleships. Some of their planes carried only machine guns. Others had bombs that were not designed for large ships, but the pilots attacked anyway. They flew low over the water, dodging anti-aircraft fire. Some dropped depth charges directly onto enemy ships. Others strapped gun crews with machine guns, even when they ran out of ammunition. Some pilots made fake attack runs just to distract the Japanese ships. These constant attacks created confusion. Japanese ships had to maneuver, dodge, and fire at incoming planes. And every minute they spent dealing with aircraft was another minute the escort carriers could escape. A battle of determination. What happened that morning was not just a battle of firepower. It was a battle of determination. The Japanese fleet had bigger ships, bigger guns, and far more experience in surface combat. But the American sailors and pilots had something else. They had urgency. They knew that if they stopped fighting, their entire group could be destroyed. So destroyers charged. Aircraft attacked repeatedly. Smoke screens filled the ocean. And escort carriers ran as fast as their engines could carry them. The Japanese perspective from the Japanese side. The situation was confusing. Admiral Kurita expected to encounter a powerful American fleet. Instead, he found all escort carriers and destroyers fighting with incredible aggression. American aircraft attacked constantly. Destroyers launched torpedo attacks. Smoke covered the ocean. Ships appeared and disappeared in the haze. It became difficult to determine exactly what forces were present. Some Japanese officers believed they might actually be facing larger American carriers or even battleships. And in naval warfare, hesitation can change everything. The battle intensifies as the fighting continued. More destroyers joined the attacks. Ships like USS Hull and USS Samuel B. Roberts also moved forward to engage the Japanese fleet. These ships were small, but they fought with extraordinary bravery. They fired guns at ships many times their size. They launched torpedoes at cruisers and battleships, and they drew enemy fire away from the carriers. Many of these ships would eventually be heavily damaged, but their actions bought time that the escort carriers desperately needed. Chaos on the ocean. The battle soon turned into complete chaos. Aircraft roared overhead. Destroyers raced across the waves. Battleships fired massive guns that shook the sea. Columns of water rose high into the air as shells struck the ocean. Smoke covered large parts of the battlefield. Ships maneuvered constantly. From a distance, it must have looked like a storm of steel and fire. And in the middle of that chaos, one small naval group continued to resist a much larger fleet. A turning point approaches despite their bravery. The situation for Taffy 3 remained extremely dangerous. Some destroyers were already damaged. Enemy ships were still closing the distance. If the Japanese fleet pushed forward just a little longer, the escort carriers might not escape. But something unexpected was about to happen. A decision made by the Japanese commander would soon change the entire course of the battle, and that decision would turn this desperate fight into one of the most surprising outcomes in naval history. By mid-morning on October 25, 1944, the battle near the island of Samar had already become one of the most unusual naval fights of the entire Second World War. On one side was Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful Japanese fleet. It included massive battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, ships designed specifically for large naval engagements. On the other side was the small American force known as Taffy 3, a group made mostly of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts. These ships were not meant to fight battleships. They were meant to support ground troops and provide air cover. Yet somehow, for more than 2 hours, this smaller force had managed to slow down one of the strongest fleets in the Pacific. But the fight had come at a heavy cost. The destroyers that refused to retreat, several American destroyers had already taken serious damage. Ships like USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts had charged directly into the Japanese formation. Their torpedo attacks forced enemy ships to maneuver. Their gunfire distracted larger cruisers, and their presence created confusion across the battlefield. But these attacks placed them directly in the path of the Japanese fleet. Shells from cruisers and battleships continued to rain down on the small American ships. The USS Johnston, which had bravely attacked the Japanese cruisers earlier, was now heavily damaged. Its steering had been damaged. Its guns were slowly being knocked out. Yet Commander Ernest Evans continued to fight. Evans had already been wounded. Still, he refused to abandon his ship. Johnston continued firing its remaining guns while maneuvering through enemy fire. For a destroyer facing multiple cruisers and battleships, survival seemed almost impossible. Eventually, the damage became too severe. After hours of fighting, USS Johnston was finally overwhelmed by enemy fire and sank into the sea. But its sacrifice had bought valuable time. The fate of USS Samuel B. Roberts, another ship, the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, also entered the fight. This ship was even smaller than the destroyers. It was designed mainly to escort convoys and hunt submarines. Yet when the battle began, its crew pushed the ship to its absolute limits. Its engines ran far beyond their normal operating levels. The ship accelerated toward the Japanese fleet. At one point, Samuel B. Roberts closed within gun range of a heavy cruiser. Its smaller guns fired rapidly. Observers later described it as one of the most aggressive actions by such a small warship during the entire war, but the cruiser's larger guns eventually found their target. Heavy shells struck the ship. After sustaining massive damage, Samuel B. Roberts was also lost. Despite the loss, its crew had done something remarkable. They had slowed a much larger enemy fleet. Air attacks continue above the ocean. American aircraft continued their attacks. Planes from the escort carriers kept returning again and again. Some pilots had already fired all their weapons. Others had dropped their bombs. Yet they continued flying toward the Japanese ships. Some aircraft made simulated attack runs. They pretended to launch torpedoes just to force Japanese ships to change direction. Others flew low across enemy decks to distract gun crews. These repeated attacks added even more confusion. From the Japanese perspective, the skies seemed full of aircraft. It was difficult to determine how many carriers might actually be nearby. Admiral Kurita's dilemma. By late morning, Admiral Kurita faced a difficult decision. His fleet had already taken damage. Several cruisers had been hit. One cruiser had been forced to withdraw after torpedo damage, and the aggressive American defense created uncertainty. Kurita did not know exactly what American forces might be nearby. Reports from his officer suggested that larger American carrier groups could be approaching. There was also the constant threat of air attacks from American aircraft operating across the Philippines. Continuing forward could mean entering an even larger battle. At the same time, the aggressive attacks from destroyers and aircraft had slowed his advance more than expected. The element of surprise had already been lost. After considering the situation, Admiral Kurita made a decision. He ordered his fleet to withdraw, an unexpected outcome. The order surprised many people on both sides. The Japanese fleet still had powerful battleships. It still had numerous cruisers and destroyers, and the American force in front of them had already suffered heavy losses. Yet the constant attacks, the confusion of the battle, and the uncertainty about other American forces had convinced Kurita to pull back. Slowly, the Japanese ships began turning away. Their powerful guns fell silent, and the largest surface fleet that Taffy III had faced began moving north. For the American sailors who had been fighting desperately for hours, the moment was almost unbelievable. The enemy fleet was leaving. The cost of the battle, even though the Japanese fleet had withdrawn, the battle had come with serious losses. Several American ships had been sunk. Hundreds of sailors had been killed or wounded. The crews of ships like Johnston, Ho, Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay had paid a heavy price. But their actions had prevented something far worse. If the Japanese fleet had broken through, they could have reached the lightly defended transport ships supporting the American landings in the Philippines. Those ships can read thousands of soldiers and enormous amounts of supplies. Their destruction could have seriously damaged the entire invasion effort. Instead, the resistance of Taffy III had forced the Japanese fleet to retreat. A battle that became legend over time. The Battle off Samar became one of the most famous naval engagements in American history. Naval historians often point out how unusual the battle was. Normally, large battleships dominate smaller ships, but in this case, smaller destroyers and escort carriers fought with such determination that they disrupted a much stronger fleet. The bravery shown by the crews of Taffy III became widely recognized. Commander Ernest Evans, the captain of USS Johnston, was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership and courage during the battle. Many other sailors received awards for their actions as well. Why this battle still matters? The Battle off Samar is often remembered not just because of its outcome, but because of what it represents. It shows how determination and leadership can influence even the most dangerous situations. The sailors of Taffy III knew they were facing a much stronger enemy. Yet they continued to fight. Destroyers charged battleships. Pilots attacked massive warships with whatever weapons they had, and escort carriers launched aircraft even while trying to escape. Their actions demonstrated how teamwork and courage could change the course of a battle. The larger war continues, although the Battle off Samar ended that morning. The larger conflict in the Pacific continued. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole marked a major turning point. It was one of the final attempts by the Japanese Navy to challenge American naval power. After these battles, Japan would struggle to rebuild its fleet strength. Meanwhile, American forces continued advancing across the Pacific toward Japan, but the events near Samar remain unforgettable. Because on that morning, a small group of ships faced overwhelming odds, and somehow they survived. Legacy of Taffy 3 today. Naval historians often describe the stand of Taffy 3 as one of the bravest naval actions ever recorded, not because they had the strongest ships, but because they fought with determination, even when victory seemed impossible. Their story remains an example of how courage and quick decision-making can shape history, and it reminds us that sometimes the outcome of a battle is not decided only by size or firepower. Sometimes it is decided by the people who refuse to give up.